You should have no trouble finding a dongle DAC that fits most of your needs. Just as with their desktop counterparts, these portable options have saturated the market and struggle to differentiate amongst each other. Today, we are taking a look at one of the newest offerings in this category. This is the Colorfly CDA-M2, which costs $160. The folks at Shenzhen Audio sent the M2 for review. These guys have a wide assortment of audiophile gear, some not available elsewhere. If you have got an itch to spend money, check out Shenzhen Audio. The M2 has dual CS43198 DAC chipsets. This is a common DAC component. In fact, the FIO KA5 also uses the 43198 and looks very similar in physical design to the M2. Colorfly says that the M2 has a unique core, renewed melody, and exemplar tonal quality, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. Sadly, that's all the company says regarding performance. As far as specifications go, the M2 supports all forms of PCM audio and DSD up to 256, which is actually the CS43198 maximum resolution capability, and not an artificial limit that Colorfly implemented. Naturally, there is no MQA support here. Of course, Colorfly says that the M2 has DAC filters, which is not an actual feature of any DAC. These filters kick in well beyond the human auditory range. Moreover, you'll be hard-pressed to find audio tracks that actually have recorded content in the 20 kHz region where these DAC filters begin to take effect. You should download a free audio analyzer and use it on your own tracks. Check your library and see how many tracks cross into the DAC filter range. Then ask yourself what your hearing limitations are due to your age and environment. I don't think Colorfly is doing anything improper by mentioning these filters, but you just need to be cognizant that they do absolutely nothing. Do not buy into the audiophile BS that says the opposite. Anyway, the M2 is compatible with some gaming consoles such as the Nintendo Switch, and it does so by using USB 1.0 protocol. Colorfly says that the M2 can have firmware upgrades in the future. That's great. However, I could not find their website, which is really disconcerting. You might have to return to the retailer's website for firmware updates. As for physical design, the M2 is a fairly beefy portable DAC. It has a combination of rounded corners and sharp edges, is made entirely of metal, and feels rather substantial. The M2 gets power through its USB-C connection and outputs through a single-ended 3.5mm or balanced 4.4mm headphone section. Each headphone output has independent amplification. That means you can fine-tune volume through both your source and the M2. Moreover, the M2 has a SPDIF out paired into the 3.5mm jack. Very few DACs have this feature, and only one I can immediately remember is the Eco Zerta, which is one of my favorite DACs. But unlike with the Zerta, you will need to activate the SPDIF output through the M2's menus. Speaking of menu, the M2 will let you select the various useless DAC filters, turn on SPDIF, invert and brighten the display, fine-tune channel balance, and select between high and low gain. Unfortunately, we don't get any EQ. The M2 has a large display. This provides the typical connection feedback: resolution, volume, filter, gain, and USB connection protocol. I really don't know why manufacturers bother putting the resolution as the largest font when the volume and gain settings are much more relevant at any given time. But that's the same juxtaposition on the M2. Finally, the M2 provides a maximum 125 milliwatts at 32 ohms through the single-ended and 250 milliwatts through the balanced. As for overall physical design, I think the M2 looks and feels quite sturdy. The M2 is not really that much larger than many other USB drive-sized DAC amps. With the USB cable connected, the M2 is yet another cumbersome protuberance off your mobile device, a weak point for your USB port on your laptop, and an inconveniently small and distant bulge on your desktop, which is sadly the nature of all portable DAC amps. For what it's worth, the M2 has all the DAC functionality the vast majority of other DACs already offer, both cheaper and more expensive than the M2. The M2 does have a few differentiating factors, such as the SPDIF, purportedly high power output, and dual CS43198 implementation. For every DAC or amp review, I conduct the same test. Simply listening and making judgment calls is not enough, as subjective impressions alone can be incredibly misleading. On the other hand, looking just at measurements when they are available can give a false sense of knowledge when you have not actually used the device. I combine measurements, again when available, with subjective listening impressions, but I make my listening tests as repeatable and science-backed as I can. This is why I rigorously conduct A/B comparisons, explain what I did, and encourage others to do the same. To that end, I tested the M2 in multiple phases. In Phase 1, I used the M2 as one of my go-to devices for several weeks. I plugged it into my desktop, laptop, iPad, and iPhone, along with my LG V30 and Windows computers. I listened to high-resolution lossless files, streamed lossy content, and consumed a variety of content. I used numerous headphones and IEMs through both the balanced and single-ended outputs. The idea in this phase was to determine if the device exhibited any odd behavior, incompatibility, or defects through regular use. In Phase 2, I compared the M2 against some alternatives. This included the Low-2-PAW S1, the CDA-M1P, EcoZerta ITM03, AudDirect Beam 4, Xduo XD05 Balance 2, and the Matrix Mini i Pro 3. I plugged each device into my Windows and Mac systems and sent signal to two at once using Voice Meter Banana on Windows and multi-output device on Mac. I plugged the single-ended output into a passive AV switch and used various headphones and IEMs to conduct numerous hours-long comparisons over several days. I tried to volume match using the built-in amps of the devices when available and through system volume controls. The goal was to determine if the M2 presented an obviously different sound from the competitors. In Phase 3, I plugged low and high impedance headphones into the M2 to figure out if the device could drive them. I used dynamic and planar headphones and IEMs for this portion of the test. Throughout this process, I used many headphones and IEMs. This list includes the Focal Elex, Bitdynamic DT880, Avantone Planar, audeze LCD2 Classic, and LCD1, Allo S5X, Moondrop Aria, Tin Hi-Fi T2, 7Hz Timeless, Final Audio B2, and some others. I strongly encourage people to conduct these types of true volume-matched A/B tests at home. For about $25, you can find the necessary off-the-shelf components to create your own test bench. If you want less reviewer and fanboy BS, I think you need to establish a reliable, repeatable testing method that mitigates against audiophile typical nonsense. Let's delve into the results of the tests. In Phase 1, I used the M2 as my daily driver. The goal was to see if it exhibited any odd behavior. The simple answer is no, it did not. The M2 functioned perfectly well with all my devices, Mac, Windows, Android, and iOS. And yes, it did in fact connect perfectly fine with my Nintendo Switch, which I barely ever play. I never encountered audible distortion or hiss or other issues. I never lost USB connection or had driver errors. All their sources immediately recognized the M2, and the physical connection on the M2's USB side was secure even when tossed into a bag or in my pocket. Even the menu navigation was intuitive. Depending on what side of the computer or mobile device you plug the USB, the M2 screen might seem upside down. Luckily, you can change the orientation in the menu. There aren't many useful options in the menu, by the way. Screen orientation might be something you use all the time. For example, when paired with my MacBook Pro, which has USB ports on the left side, the M2 screen default was upside down. Now, this DAC will save the screen orientation setting, as well as the last played volume, headphone depop selection, and filter settings. In order for the M2 to remember the last volume you had when you plugged the DAC back into a USB port, you will need to actually play music through the M2. In other words, plugging the DAC into a USB port, then adjusting volume without playing anything, and then unplugging and replugging the M2 won't save the volume setting. You actually have to play audio through the M2 when you set that volume. It's a minor quirk, I think, but there it is. Overall, in Phase 1, I never found anything to complain about. Everything functions as it should, and I never encountered a problem which would impact usability or audio performance. Now, let's move to phase 2. This is where I compared in an A-B setup how the M2 sounded to other DACs. I think everyone should spend the measly $25 it takes to build your own A-B test bench and do these kinds of comparisons. There's so much misinformation, hype, and audiophile nonsense where DACs and amps are concerned that it can easily be led to wasting money. Sometimes you do in fact come across something that sounds different. Take the Border Patrol DAC, Jolita Glass FX, Woo Audio WA7, hifi Zen DAC, and Bellari HA543 as some examples. But the typical hi-fi companies like Topping, SMSL, Colorfly, and many others are not spending any noticeable effort into making any alterations to the sound. They're taking the stock DAC chipset and plugging them into chassis. And you can figure this out yourself if you conduct proper volume-matched A/B tests using a strict testing method. Anyway, having said that, I could not find anything remotely different sonically between the M2 and the other DACs I compared against. When volume is mismatched, there is a perception of altered sound, a bit more bass or clarity here, or more harshness over there. Try that yourself in your A/B test using test bench gear. Mismatch volume on purpose and see if you hear a difference. Fundamentally, the M2 is a neutral, flat, transparent DAC. It sounds identical to many competitors in the market. Finally, in phase 3, I plugged various headphones and IAMs into the M2 to figure out if it struggled to drive anything. I used low and very high impedance gear. And the simple answer is that the M2 had no difficulty powering the majority of my gear, even the 600 ohm T1. Planar dynamic headphones like the LCD2, Aventone Planar, and Sivka Phoenix work perfectly well on the M2. But very specialized headphones such as the Argon performed very poorly on the M2 or anything significantly below 1 watt. Ultimately, I think the M2 is a very good DAC. It does what it is supposed to do. It offers plentiful power for the majority of headphones and IAMs in the market, and is portable enough to use on the go. I have no problem recommending the M2 if you're looking for a new portable DAC amp. I think the price tag is agreeable, given the build. However, the M2 at $160 does what much cheaper DAC amps already accomplish. I mean, take a look at your audio. If you're not going above 24-bit audio, then you have got lots and lots of cheaper alternatives. The screen on the M2 is nice, but does not add anything unique to the mix. The most useful feature of a screen on products like this is the volume indicator. And yet again, on another product, that information is relegated to the corner of the screen in small font. The audio resolution once again gets the bulk of the screen, and that seems to be a pretty odd choice, given the whole point is to enjoy the music, not to constantly glance at the resolution. I really wish Colorfly or any of these manufacturers would put more effort into their software and hardware. Give me EQ, like Low2 does with their PAW series. Maybe toss in a Bluetooth module and a battery like Fio does in their BTR gear. The audiophile DAC market is full of cheap and expensive options, and they all seem to replicate each other in features. Sadly, Colorfly cannot really distinguish itself from the mix. In fact, until Low2 discontinued the PAW S1, that DAC was my primary example of what an excellent DAC amp should be. Low2 released the PAW S2 and significantly increased the price, but as of right now, the S2 is currently on sale for about $190. You will have to do your own research, but I think the S2 makes a more compelling argument than the M2 does. The Low2 PAW S2 has MQA support, built-in EQ, a similar size, and sufficient amplification for the majority of headphones and IAMs. It just does more than the M2 and many other DACs. However, if you are enamored by the design and build and want what the M2 has to offer, specifically with its power output and SPDIF, then I think it could be a worthwhile purchase. Maybe with future firmware updates, Colorfly might add some new features. And as they say, hope springs eternal.